being here. Dark and stormy night. I think I know all of you, like, minus a few. So I'm Ryan Thompson. I'm the department chair here in our design program. Standing in for Baker, who would normally be introducing serial gallery lectures and openings. But tonight we have Corrine Rose. I keep checking myself on that one, but it's Corrine. And Corrine has a background in museum education and consultancy. Has worked for places such as the Museum of Contemporary Photography. Currently working with the Art Institute. Studied a bit at Columbia, right? College in Chicago. And she's going to talk a little bit about her experience in that field of museum education, and as well about her connection with Cecil and the work in the gallery right now. So we're really glad to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Thanks. Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for moving forward. I really want this to be a discussion and a dialogue, and I want it to be useful and helpful to you in your own knowledge. So I wanted to start by just surveying you all a bit. I've heard that there were going to be a mix of art and education majors. Yes? Is that true? Raise your hand if you're an artist. Artist. You're an artist if you make art and you're working on learning art, right? Own it. Educators, education majors? Okay, a few. Okay. Well, the work in the gallery right now is by Cecil McDonald. Has everybody seen that show? Yeah? So Cecil is an old friend of mine. I've known him for a good 15 years, and we've done some work together. I actually expect he might show up at some point later tonight, and then we can turn this into a dialogue with him as well. But Cecil is known as a teaching artist. He's been working in Chicago public schools for many years now. In Chicago, there's a very rich tradition, and some of you may come across this in your own career. You get this art degree, and then what do you do with it, right? Maybe some of you could share, what are you thinking of in terms of goals after you graduate? What ideas? Just informally, casually? Yes?
Hopefully to someday be shown in galleries as well as museums.
Great, great. So that's, I think we all probably aspire to that, right? Showing our work in galleries and museums. What else? Advertising? Okay, so maybe a practical application, so maybe graphic design, advertising. Okay, good, good. Well, myself, I have an art degree for most of us. Once we get out of school, the reality is you might be gigging around a bit. You might be taking things here and there and doing what you can. And a lot of you might end up teaching, whether or not you have a background in teaching. So Cecil's work, this is a tradition that I come from as well. I have my MFA in photography. And after I graduated from school, it was kind of like, you know, full-time jobs aren't coming around, what do we do? So in Chicago, there's actually a very rich tradition of the teaching artists, of artists who go and visit. It could be a school, it could be a community center, it could be working within an elderly population, prisons, who go out and take their artistic practice and share it with others. Many of those artists also make work collaboratively within those populations. And Cecil is someone who works very deeply, collaboratively with various audiences. So yes, field of teaching artistry. Cecil and I both have done a lot of work in Chicago public schools. Chicago public schools are interesting to work in. My former job, I was the director of education at the Museum of Contemporary Photography, and I had programs in 3 different schools. Each of those schools was extremely different. Chicago, you probably know, is a very segregated city, right? So there are schools that are almost entirely African American, schools that are almost entirely Mexican. So it can be a very different landscape depending on where you're working. So it's a very, very interesting and can be at times a very challenging but also rewarding way to work. Chicago Public Schools, and I should say I'm a CPS mom, my own kids are in CPS, but it's about 87% of the kids live below the poverty line, and about the same number are also ethnic minorities. So it's a very specific thing. I have a quote here from Cecil that says, "I treat the classroom as a studio. We experiment, we explore, we make stuff that examines ideas, history, and political issues." Okay, so that's basically how he works. He works very collaboratively with students in a very open-ended way, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But before we begin with talking about Cecil, I want to do something called a close read. So my own work, a lot of what I focus on is visual literacy. in working with students on how to read and examine and critically pull apart photographs and images. So I want to do that together today because I think it's a great jumping off point, okay? So without introducing this picture at all, I want to just start by asking you all to just chime in and just start to talk about what's pulling your attention in this picture. Okay, foreground, child in the cart. Why do you think your attention is drawn to her?
She has a lot of emotion. She's screaming or yelling. So
Look.
that just captures your attention right away because that's something most people know as a child screaming.
Okay, good. So there's a lot of emotion there. First of all, it is central in the image in terms of design. We want to think about image design as well as content at the same time. So she appears to be yelling. What else?
She's highlighted like surrounded by black, so the lighting on her face shines through, and her face is right in the middle of the photo.
Okay, so there's a kind of a warm lighting here, a nice lighting, and she is lit, right? In photographs, whatever is lit will show. That's going to stand out. What else do you notice about this scene? Where do we find her? Yes.
She seems to be in some kind of a junkyard with a bunch of tires in the background. And there's like a specific, like, I think that's a dumpster. It says like no cash on it. But that seems to be something that points out very specifically.
Okay, good. So anytime we see words in a photograph, and if you are image makers, if you're taking a portrait of somebody and they have words on their shirt, the viewer of that image is going to read those words before they even look at the face. So words in photographs and images in general are very dominant, prominent. So you're noticing the words no cash, right? So everything when we look at a photograph, people think that a photographer or a painter starts with an empty canvas. A photographer starts with an empty rectangle, right? They're making a lot of very specific choices about what to put in and what to leave out and how to photograph their subject. And we want to be mindful of that. People tend to think a photograph that we take a picture as if we pull it out of the sky rather than constructing it very carefully and toward a certain end, okay? So no cash, right? And it sounds like you're pointing to the fact that you think the photographer is wanting us to notice that that's a dominant thing.
Right, yes. Because it's like right there near the center and it's highlighted in, well not highlighted, it's like spelled out in white letters, very visible, very readable. So I think, and given the location, it might be a good donor right there.
Good, right. So everything in the picture counts. We have to deal with all of it, okay? What else?
Like you said, how everything in the picture counts. I think in retrospect, everything not in the picture also counts. So the fact that there isn't a caretaker, a mother or father, someone tending to the screaming child also speaks volumes in regards to the kid screaming.
Excellent, excellent. That's extremely important. We need to think of what's beyond the frame. What do we not see in a photograph is sometimes as important as what we do see. So no caretaker, no parent, no other children. Do we know that for sure? We don't see anybody here, but we don't actually know that she's totally alone, right? How about the moods or the feelings of the picture?
Everything feels very run down,
Okay.
and it's interesting that she's in a shopping cart in the middle of this like parking lot area. That kind of brings to mind homeless people using the shopping cart to carry around all of their stuff. Yeah, just a very random place for a child to be.
Great. Does it feel safe to you or nurturing? No? What else about mood or feeling? Yes, you can just shout it out.
The fact that it's getting dark out, it kind of makes me feel a little uneasy because she could be left there at night alone in a sketchy place.
Good. She could be left there alone. It's a little bit harder to see this, but she's also got some dirt on her clothes and on her face. If we were to sort of sum this up into a story, if we were to tell the story of this picture based on what we see, what do you think is the story being told here? Abandonment, okay.
When I immediately saw the photo, I kind of thought of like maybe a homeless mother taking her child looking for anything to salvage. And
Okay.
in some cases, you can't take your kid with you into more dangerous areas. So the mother might be in like a trash bin or somewhere even more farther into the dump or junkyard or back alley, and she's leaving her kid there because even though it's not safe, where she's going might be even like dangerous or not yet safe or even more sketchy.
Okay.
I feel like it's a homeless family.
Okay, homeless family, but you're still picking up on this idea of danger, a lack of safety for the girl. Other interpretations, other things you're noticing? How about, do we know that she's screaming?
She could be crying.
Or yawning? Mm-hmm. How do you think she got into that cart?
Someone had to put her there.
Somebody probably had to put her there. You know, like a child that age, if you've dealt with a child that age, it's pretty hard for them to get in a cart like that. Somebody probably had to wedge her little legs in there, right? So what do we know for sure here? What do we know for certain about this image? So it may be difficult for her to get out of the car? Mm-hmm. What have we established as facts, and what are some things that we're guessing on or projecting into the image?
So if someone like intentionally put her there, she didn't choose it. Like she didn't have like her own sense of authority to like choose to be there. Someone had to have placed her there.
Okay, so it's sort of basic information we know for sure here is girl in shopping cart, right? We're not quite sure, we don't exactly know how she got in there, but we know girl in shopping cart appears to be a junkyard. Abandonment, do we know that to be true? Screaming, do we know that to be true? No. What do you think, what assumptions might we have made here? Gender, gender is a bit ambiguous here. We're not really sure if this is a girl or a boy. We don't really know if she is screaming. I mean, I think the impression, probably all of us are coming away with this image that this girl is howling out of being abandoned by her family. I mean, that is, I think, the general impression that this photograph makes, right? But that is not necessarily what's happening in this photograph. And I actually know this photographer, as does Cecil. He teaches at Columbia. The girl actually was yawning, and behind the photographer was a bunch of other kids who were playing, right? But what do you think the photographer intended to show us with this picture? What do you think the statement was he wanted to make?
I like this thing to do with the no cash refund in the background.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't give back the child.
Yeah, you know, I think he's making political statements here about you know, this, about poverty and about children, you know, but I think he's sort of projecting this into this child rather than this actually being what was happening here. And so what I'm hoping to achieve here is every time we approach a photograph, we need to learn to read it like we read written language. We need to pull apart all of the details and think about what each little part contributes. We need to think about who was the maker of the image, for what purpose did they make this image, and all of these different things that are going on here, okay? Because representation is a very powerful thing. How we choose to represent other people as well as ourselves is a very powerful thing. And it's a very important thing, and I urge you all as educators as well as image makers and artists to think about that. So that's going to be a sub-theme of what we talk about tonight is representation of ourselves and others, okay? So visual literacy. So a real big interest of my study and something that I see happening throughout all of Cecil's work in that gallery is the idea that much of the information that young people, including you all, consume today comes to us through visual imagery, yet very few students are taught to read photographs and visual images as they are taught to read written language. You all have probably done that a bit more than some because many of you are art students, but I think that's a very important thing and something we're going to be touching on tonight. So it's very important that we all need to learn to be critical consumers and creators of images. We need to be mindful of what the images around us are, how they're acting on us, what they contain, as well as what we put out in the world as we enter our careers and become creators of images. Also, something that I see throughout Cecil's work and something that we should think about is to have agency over one's own likeness and image is a form of power. I truly believe that is a form of social justice, of having agency and ownership over how you are represented and how communities are represented as well, right? So we're thinking about mindfulness in this area tonight. So Cecil has been working with young people in Chicago Public Schools for at least the past 15 years or so. He's done various projects. He's worked collaboratively. He loves to work with youth and teens. He's also worked collaboratively with other artists. The artist he worked with on this project is named Avery R. Young, and he's a spoken word poet. He's really known in the spoken word community. And the two of them have a great collaborative relationship. They work together. They design these residencies. So this is Cecil's statement on this work right here. When the world looks at me, what should it see? Conceived as a billboard project in partnership with fellow teaching artist and poet Avery R. Young, we created an advertising campaign that would portray these children as they truly were, citizens of the world and with all the potential for greatness and, more important, ordinariness without conditions or labels. The students were given cameras to photograph their neighborhoods, friends, and families. The resulting images were combined with short poetic line of copy that then spoke to the resulting image. This Regulo campaign became a critical lens in which the students could view themselves in opposition to the images created by the world at large. So, young people of color. When we think of young people of color, what representations tend to come to mind? Violence, okay. We're not saying what we think they are, we're saying what we see out in popular culture and media. Other stereotypes?
I mean, I'm saying free to speak about stereotypes.
We're free to speak about, we're not saying that that's what we, yeah.
Poverty.
Poverty?
Maybe like a lack of education.
Okay.
It's normally more in an urban setting rather than a rural setting,
Okay.
where that might be more evident in Chicago area.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of representation, I mean, there's misrepresentation across all kinds of types of people, and we're going to go into that a little bit more. But young people of color are especially misrepresented, and that's something that Cecil and Avery, who are both African American, work on a lot, is giving them, again, agency over how they are represented and working against some of the pervasive cultural stereotypes that can really impact us in terms of how we feel about ourselves and how we feel about others. Okay, I'm interested here, and he says, with the potential for greatness and, more important, ordinariness. What do you think they mean by ordinary, allowing them to be ordinary? Yeah, they're just teenagers, they're just young people. You know, it's not a separate people, right? So these are his words, and I like them very much. So this, for about 12 years, I did a show at the Museum of Contemporary Photography that was called Talking Back, Chicago Youth Respond, and we got work from teens from all over the city, from 10 different schools, and Cecil Naverly worked in 2 or 3 different schools and did text and dialogue with image with the teenagers in terms of creating their own representations. They looked at various genres in photography as well. They looked at portraiture and thinking about how portraits are made and what's said. And they also asked the students to look at environment. You know, I mean, this is a very typical Chicago landscape and home. Okay, love this picture. Talk to me about this one. Tell me about these young men.
They're dressed really well.
They're dressed very well, right? How does it look like they feel? What was that?
Forced to sit there.
Forced to sit there? Okay, possibly. We're not sure the degree to which the image is set up or to which they set it up. What else? Yes?
Confidence.
Yeah, confident. How does that show?
Because they got stern looks on their face, like they're not looking to be scared by anything that comes knocking their way.
Right. They don't look intimidated by whoever is taking this picture. We always have to imagine that the photographer there's always another person present there, right? So they don't look intimidated. Their body language is a bit haughty. They're dressed very well. Okay. Any idea of the year, time period? Could be There's an actual indication, there's actually a way we can tell. Anybody find it? 1941, right. If we knew fashion history or cars a little bit better, you could probably peg it through different things, but the license plate actually says 1941. So this image was made by Russell Lee. Have you talked about the Farm Security Administration at all? There was a group of photographers that went around the country in the Great Depression and got paid by the government to document America. Russell Lee photographed on the South Side for some time. I don't know the exact location of this, but this is on the South Side of Chicago. So Cecil, in working with young people, I share this belief that it's important to show them a really big range of imagery, that we tend to see the same kind of images over and over again, and we need to expose all students to a really good range of very well-made and interesting photographs. Another thing that this photograph demonstrates is that history is captured in pictures. At the time this was made, you wouldn't think, oh, look at the cool old car. It just was the car that was around them, or look at the suits and the hats. And you wouldn't be thinking of the fashion as indicator of time, but when we look at it today, it is this slice of history. And actually, it would be very interesting. This is a boulevard. I was trying to figure out where this is, and I couldn't, but somebody probably could. Like, where is this exact location? And we could look at this photograph and think of how this street even has changed in that time. I love this. So Cecil and Avery did a project called The Remix. Okay, so they're exposing the students to these historic images, especially historic images of African Americans in Chicago. And then, as artists, this is something that often we do is you always learn from great artists, you borrow from great artists, but you still have to make it your own. So that was their challenge. He gave them these images and had them remix it and remake it with some references to the past image and also making it their own today. So he says, I designed this residency to find a way to unearth something new in photography and poetry from something given. The ideas for this project come from hip-hop culture that is postmodern culture, which is how Black people carved out a niche in a postmodern world. With youth, it comes out of appropriating music from the older generation and making it their own. Students in this project were asked to remix or recreate compositions of iconic photographs by master photographers, including works by Nicholas Nixon, Wayne Miller, Marilyn Mark, Russell Lee, Roy DeCarava, and Gordon Parks. The image on the left is by Russell Lee, 1941. The image on the right is the one that the students created collaboratively with Cecil. Okay, similarities or differences?
Same color.
Mm-hmm. Color photography would have been rare in 1941, but possible, but rare, not used very often.
I want to assume with Cecil's that there's a mix of gender.
So there's a mix of gender. Okay, interesting. And who's in the middle? That girl there. I love how she becomes central, and we have that young man there in the center in the Russell Lee image from 1941. But now we have this girl sort of taking, just through her sort of body language and stance, this prominent position in the image. Okay, so they look very serious. I mean, they're trying to be serious, and they're posing themselves for the camera, but they're having a lot of fun here too. I mean, they brought their clothes, they changed their clothes, they were thinking about. So this one I forgot to tell you. The Russell Lee image is called Sunday Best. This is Easter Sunday, that one, 1941. So the kids thought about church. What are we going to wear? We're going to wear our church clothes. We're going to dress up, and they staged this, and that's actually the hood of Cecil's car. He's got a big Mercury something. So this is Cecil's collaborative partner, Avery R. Young. As I mentioned, he's a spoken word poet. And so this is another image that was restaged, an earlier image on the left. This man is holding a sign, and they're thinking about protest here too, and exposing the students to protest. If Negro men can carry guns for Uncle Sam, surely they can drive milk wagons for Bowman Dairy. So Avery continued that sign, carried it into today, and the kids here are acting as art director collaboratively with Avery and Cecil. So these are some of the works in the show, and I'm just giving you some context here. I just sat with Cecil and spoke with him about these projects yesterday, and he talked about the power of collaboration in his life. He loves to work collaboratively, and he and I were talking about I like to work collaboratively too. And in a really good collaboration, the idea is the sum of 1 and 1 is more than 2. Something new happens, something bigger than the parts comes together. And Cecil said that's something he's he's getting close to 50 now, but something as he's gotten a little bit older that he said he doesn't feel like he has to own it all himself. He doesn't have to be the sole name on the artwork, and that by collaborating he can bring in, he doesn't have to know every single thing, and he can bring in, you know, maybe somebody who has some technical knowledge that he doesn't have, or who has a particular skill or talent, and that they can, you know, bring those things together. So he works that way with collaborators, with adults as well as with teens. And he says the teens really inspire him, that their ideas, sometimes they have fresh things that would never have occurred to him. And so he works very much in dialogue with many different collaborative partners. When I look at Cecil's work, I'm also very mindful that 21st century learners, in terms of visual literacy, need to be able to gain skills working across discipline, genre, and sources of information. So throughout all the work in that show, Cecil and the kids are working across multiple disciplines: poetry, photography, theater. They're pulling in historic documents from slavery and a lot of different elements, which I think is a really rich, in terms of art as well as education, a really rich way for students to learn and necessary today. Okay, stereotypes and cliches. We touched on this a bit. So a stereotype is a widely held or limited or false characterization of a particular type of person or thing. Stereotypes can apply to race, culture, gender, age, religion, physical ability, weight, social group, sexual orientation, gender identity, on and on and on. We need to be, again, very mindful of this, and I see at play in a lot of Cecil's work that he's trying to show. I've worked with a lot of teens myself, and often if you haven't worked with them for a while in establishing what a portrait is, the first thing they do if you give them a camera is to hop into some pose they've seen somewhere, right? And some cliche thing that you just, it kind of makes you cringe. You're like, that's not you, you know, like, you're smart, you know, you're good at sports, you like to read. Like, how do we get those things in our images instead of falling back on cliches and stereotypes? And that's a challenge. I mean, it's a challenge even without people. Just, you know, you think love, and the first thing that comes to mind is the heart and the flower, right? Like, we've seen that, we've done that. How to make things fresh and new and real without falling back on stereotypes. I pulled this image here. Do you guys know what stock photography is? Yeah. So a big way that people make money in the field of photography is to create images for image banks that people can access by certain subjects and buy. So you can pay like $100 to use an image that somebody has made. So I was looking through a stock photo bank and just looked up old woman, right? So of course you start looking through those and you see how a lot of the stereotypes get perpetuated. That there is this bank of images of old women, and this one here, you know, just that this, it's just, personally I find this offensive, you know? This is, we can do better, image makers. Let's not do this, right? So the cliche of the old woman is being kind of confused and out of it and goofy, right? I thought today, I was thinking, okay, well, sometimes when we talk about stereotypes, it's like, let's deal with people in the room. This is a Christian college, right? So I Googled stock photography Christian woman, and this is what came up. Not sure how you all feel about that. We have some very different views here. This one seems to be quite, speaking of like this situation being a forced one, like being forced into prayer, right? This one, perhaps more attractive and positive, but also kind of cliche, kind of simple, of just hands in prayer and sky. People of color, again, the cliches get bad fast, and so we need to be mindful. So these captions here, the guy on the left, obviously he's sexualized, he's got a gun. The tag words here that people are searching and using these in industry, it says African American man standing with gun in hand, thug and gangsta concept. So there are people who are actually looking for thug and gangsta to sell what, I'm not sure, but they get widely used for a variety of purposes. And we need to be critical consumers, and we need to point this out. Students it's harder for us. We can look at this and say, okay, just bad. But our students see this so often that sometimes they start to buy into those images, right? And that can be very damaging. So the one here, image 2, stock agency caption, group of young men and women in hip hop fashion. And you often hear hip hop as a derogative term, right? As being sort of this here, right? So Cecil and Avery in their teaching, I see Cecil, again, we have to unlearn some of those images that become pervasive. This is a photographer named Jamal Shabazz, photographing in the late 1980s. And I know Cecil has used these as teaching images for his students. And thinking about these young men having agency over their image, and these young men working with Jamal Shabazz to present themselves to the camera. And he's clearly sensitive to thinking about who they are and how they might want to be seen, that they're stylish. Two of them are wearing nice hats that look like they could have come from this hat store. The hat store teaches us a bit about their community as well, a place that's possibly important to them, right? Another Jamal Shabazz image, but again, created collaboratively with the subject, and the subject having agency about how he or she is presented to the camera and how their image is used. So giving these students a steady diet of alternatives to the cliches and the bad stuff that's out there. This, a different idea on the remix. Remix revisited the fly pics. Referencing the photography of Jamal Shabazz, Shabazz's photographs celebrate the cool style of early hip-hop culture between 1980 and 1989. Rooted in the tradition of urban street photography, Shabazz shows the subject striking a pose and staring straight into the camera. 8th grade students translate portraits into fashion layout formats, merged with price points and epistle poems that reflect their attitudes toward their apparel and relationship to global economics. Okay, so looking at Shabazz's images and thinking of like, well, how can we photograph ourselves in the same way? So what is this young woman doing? Splits? Why do you think she's doing the splits?
Well, she chose to strike that pose like with her photos. It's probably something she's proud of.
Yeah. Exactly, because she can, right? Not many people can do the splits, and so Cecil and Avery are in dialogue with her. Like, let's, instead of just this like superficial jumping into some pose, let's think about who are you and what are your skills, what are your talents, what is unique to you, what is special about you, what are you interested in, and trying to get. I like to think of it with students as an inside-out portrait. It's a real hard thing to do, how to get what's on the inside to show on the outside in a portrait. And this year, clearly this girl is taking pride in the fact that she can do that. At the same time, they're having the students think about, this idea of consumption and needing material goods to feel good, about thinking about like the cost of their clothing and, the $200 pair of shoes and all that, and then thinking about what that means in the wider global economy. These young men as well, and again, they're working with the photographer, so they're working with Cecil to arrange themselves and have ownership over their image. So this project, he called it Photography, Slavery, and Abolition in Pre-Civil War United States. Students used primary source photographs of slavery and free African Americans. There's a book by Deborah Willis, who's an African-American photohistorian, who's amassed a lot of pictures that you wouldn't otherwise come across, to learn about the abolitionist movement and conditions of slavery. Students learned how to properly make observations and then analyze primary source documents in order to facilitate content learning. Finally, students made their own memes and provided written rationale using primary source photographs. So this, in terms of looking at and understanding imagery, this is one, when I looked at this, there are certain things that I understand. I know the history of photography very well, and I assumed an image of this era made around the time of abolition in the 1860s. An African-American person being photographed is generally being photographed by a white person. They're probably not being photographed for their own family or consumption because it was not accessible. But this is one image where I felt like, okay, I need to know a little bit more here to understand this. So the students, one thing I like again about Cecil and Avery's work is they're working throughout different genres and types. So getting the students to think about memes. And the challenge he gave them is, imagine you're working with Frederick Douglass, who was a black abolitionist, and you're doing an advertising campaign of memes to try to people to get to understand the abolition movement and the importance of abolishing slavery. So this one I read, okay, no longer marching to a 3/5 beat. This is something that the students came up with and decided to apply here, and they did a bunch of them. But I was like, 3/5 beat, I'm not sure. There's historic reference there that I don't know. So I looked it up. My guess is around this time there was a movement in government for slave owners in slave owning states that slaves could be counted as 3/5 of a person, to give the slave owners more power in local government and national government. So I'm assuming here that they're thinking we are not 3/5 of a person. We are not going to be classified as 3/5 of a people. We are whole people, right? But just a lot of the work that is involved here is process. The amount of learning that went in here, that the students are thinking about the Emancipation Proclamation, they're learning about life under slavery, they're looking at historic images of slaves, and then they're creating through appropriation, which is a new form, different form, rather than photographing themselves or their peers. They're working with existing images and riffing on them and creating new things from appropriation. So in my mind as an educator, this is really rich and deep learning that's going on here. Reflections from a new school of historians. Part of, in terms of thinking of the history of photography and even recorded history, is whose stories get recorded, whose pictures get recorded, what stories get told and perpetuated, right? So giving agency to these young people of color. A residency in partnership with Friends of Beulah Shoesmith School that examines ideas of fear, courage, and freedom. The students learned about 6 great African Americans featured in the book and exhibit, Let Resistance Be Your Motto. Researched and discussed how life could have been for these men and women who grew up in segregated America in juxtaposition to their own experiences as a youth in modern America. This exhibition features photographs, writings, sound design, and films of students and text. So there's excerpts from each of these projects in the gallery, okay? And we're going to go over there next and just check out some of the works that we haven't really touched on and talk a little bit more in the gallery. But right now, does anybody have any questions? Or I'm happy to answer questions about professional practice too, about museum work. I mean, that's for me. Again, I have my MFA in photography, but when I was in graduate school, I assumed that I would be working to get my work in museums and galleries, and after a while decided, you know what, that's a pretty tough road, and I'm not sure I want that, and I went into museum work, using my knowledge of art and photography to work in a museum, which is a path that does exist. So questions so far? Yes?
So how would you suggest for us to get connected to the education and systems in Chicago for us? Is there like a coalition as well?
If you wanted to be a teaching artist?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would gain any experience that you can here. I was a teaching artist myself, and then to be able to reach more students, I had a program where I hired teaching artists. So I had 6 at a time that were working for me in pairs and going out to different schools. So most people, it's a catch-22, as is most things when you're just getting started in your careers. Most people want people with experience. So the best thing to do is to get I would always ask them first, if they hadn't worked in schools, did you TA in college? Did you assist any professors? Did you do any teaching whatsoever? Did you maybe work at even a day camp for students or something like that? It's probably a good idea to seek out some volunteer work. You sometimes have to do that, even if, I was not a trust fund kid. It's hard when, there's kids who have family money who can work for free and not get paid. But you might have to do a little free work for a while you wait tables and build up your experience. But I would offer to volunteer. Find out as much as you can. Students would often ask me to sort of teach them about what we would do and give them more information. And as long as they had done their background research, if they had read about my programs online and then said hey, could I talk to you a little bit more? Seek people out, ask them questions about how they got started and what avenues, what organizations do you know of? And there's tons of organizations in Chicago that work with teaching artists. And if you have your eye on them and you're reading about them, some of them, there's an organization called Marwin that hires teaching assistants rather than starting as a full teacher. You might assist a teacher for a while and build your way up. So, Marwin.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes.
Teaching artist, would you get your own classroom, or would you be working with a group of schools?
That's a very good question, and it totally depends on the different model. The programs that I ran more recently were after school. So I ran after-school photography programs that but we would still have to find our way into the school. You have to have knowledge of the culture of the schools, and you have to build relationships to be able to get in there. But we worked after school with the support of a teacher who would let us to use their room. And as an independent consultant and educator, I've also done what's called arts integration work, where you collaborate with a classroom teacher, where you go in, again, like creating dialogue between word and picture, like Cecil and Avery do. You might work with an English teacher and bring photography to bear in an English classroom. So there are many, many different models and many different ways of working. And you can, learn about them and see what is best suited for you. Other questions? There's a video I like in there, and I guess, I don't know, we can be informal in the gallery. I mean, we could go through and I could maybe touch on, there's a couple that we haven't, that we didn't do here, and I'll just speak really briefly. But there's sort of a difference between a teacher and a teaching artist, and I see that in Cecil's work. Like classroom teachers, Cecil is not a trained educator, neither am I don't have an education degree. But there is a sort of a different thing that happens when you work with kids over a long period of time and you bring your artistic practice to bear, and they relate to you in a very different way. Like they usually just call you by your first name, and it's kind of more casual, and they often really come to know and rely on you. It can be a very sort of intensive relationship, but it's different than the sort of formality of a classroom teacher and a teaching artist. Okay, so let's step into the gallery, and then I'm happy to, there's a piece that I didn't get in the slideshow. We'll talk about just a couple things there, and then I'll also answer any questions. I'm happy to hang around.